The rain hammered against the glass windows of the downtown coffee shop as 8-year-old Daniel pressed his face against the cold surface, watching the suited figures hurry past with their briefcases and umbrellas. His worn sneakers, 2 sizes too big and held together with duct tape, dangled from the wooden chair as he clutched a crumpled dollar bill in his small fist. The laces of his shoes dragged on the floor, frayed and tangled, just like everything else in his life. What happened next would change not just his world, but the heart of the most powerful man in the city. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David Chen had built his empire on precision. Every morning, at exactly 6:15, his driver would pull up to his penthouse building. By 6:30, he was reviewing quarterly reports in the back of his Mercedes, and by 7 sharp, he was commanding boardroom meetings that decided the fate of thousands of employees. At 42, he was the youngest CEO in his company's history, running a tech corporation worth $8 billion. His suits cost more than most people made in a month, his watch could fund a small business, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him the nickname The Machine among his staff. But success had come at a price that David was only beginning to understand. 3 years ago, his wife Linda had taken their twin sons, Michael and Stephen, and moved across the country after filing for divorce. The papers cited emotional neglect and chronic absence. David had been in Tokyo closing a merger deal when the divorce was finalized. He'd missed his sons' birthday parties, soccer games, school plays, and eventually, he'd missed their childhood entirely. Now they were 11, living in Seattle with their mother and a stepfather who attended every game David had skipped. The penthouse apartment that overlooked the city felt more like a museum than a home. Awards lined the walls. Business magazines featuring his face as Executive of the Year gathered dust on marble tables, and the silence was broken only by the hum of expensive appliances he never used. David ate most of his meals at the office, or in 5-star restaurants where he conducted business, surrounded by people who wanted something from him but never truly saw him. Meanwhile, 8 blocks away in the rundown Riverside neighborhood, Daniel Martinez was learning that some hungers couldn't be filled with food. The Riverside Children's Home had been his address for 4 years, ever since his grandmother passed away from complications related to diabetes. She had been his whole world, the woman who taught him to say his prayers each night and reminded him that good things come to those who wait patiently for God's timing. The state had placed him in the system when no other relatives could be found, and he'd bounced between 3 different homes before landing at Riverside. Mrs. Patterson, the director, did her best with limited resources and too many children. 23 kids between the ages of 5 and 16 lived in the converted Victorian house, sharing bedrooms, bathrooms, and the constant uncertainty of never knowing if today would be the day someone wanted to adopt them. Daniel had watched friends get placed with families, their beds quickly filled with new arrivals, who carried the same hope in their eyes that he'd once carried. But hope, he'd learned, was a fragile thing that got smaller each time prospective parents looked past him to younger children or siblings who came as a set. At 8 years old, Daniel had developed the independence of someone much older. He made his own breakfast when the older kids grabbed all the cereal first, mended his clothes with a sewing kit Mrs. Patterson had taught him to use, and had learned to disappear when the stress of managing so many children made the adults short-tempered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His most prized possession was a photograph of his grandmother holding him as a toddler, creased from being handled so much but still showing her warm smile and the love in her eyes. The thing that bothered Daniel most wasn't the secondhand clothes or the shared spaces or even the uncertainty about his future. It was his shoes. Every morning he'd sit on the edge of his narrow bed and stare down at the laces that seemed to mock him. The other children had learned to tie their shoes years ago, but Daniel had missed that lesson. His grandmother had been too sick in her final months to teach him, and in the chaos of the children's home, it was the kind of small detail that got overlooked. He'd tried watching YouTube videos on the ancient computer in the common room, but his fingers couldn't replicate what the screen showed him. He'd tried asking Mrs. Patterson, but she was always rushing between crises, promising to help later when things calmed down. So Daniel had developed a system. He'd tuck the laces inside his shoes each morning, pull the tongues up high to hide them, and shuffle carefully through his day, hoping no one would notice. During gym class, he'd volunteer to help the teacher with equipment to avoid activities that might expose his secret. On the playground, he'd stick to the swings where his feet didn't touch the ground. It was an exhausting way to live, constantly vigilant about something so simple that everyone else took for granted. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Daniel had gotten up early to avoid the bathroom rush, eaten a piece of toast with peanut butter while standing at the kitchen counter, and carefully tucked his laces away before Mrs. Patterson announced that she needed someone to walk to the corner store for milk. Daniel volunteered immediately. These small errands were his favorite part of the day, brief escapes where he could pretend he was just a regular kid walking to the store for his family. The autumn air was crisp, and Daniel pulled his thin jacket tighter as he walked down Riverside Avenue toward downtown. The children's home sat at the boundary between two worlds. Behind him stretched blocks of rundown houses, corner stores with bars on the windows, and empty lots where weeds grew through cracked concrete. Ahead lay the gleaming business district with its towering office buildings, expensive restaurants, and people who moved with the confidence that came from never having to worry about where their next meal would come from. Daniel loved these walks into the other world. He'd press his nose against bakery windows and inhale the smell of fresh bread, watch business people talking on phones about deals and meetings that sounded important, and imagine what it would be like to belong somewhere that solid and permanent. Sometimes he'd sit on the bench outside the huge office building on 5th Street and watch the parade of suits coming and going, wondering what their lives were like when they went home to houses where children had their own bedrooms and parents who helped them with homework. It was on this particular morning, with storm clouds gathering overhead and his stomach rumbling because breakfast had been smaller than usual, that Daniel's carefully tucked lace finally worked itself loose from his left shoe. The lace slipped out just as Daniel reached the busy intersection of 5th and Main, directly in front of the towering glass building that housed Chen Technologies. He looked down in horror as the frayed string dragged behind his left foot, collecting dirt and debris from the sidewalk. Panic shot through his chest. He couldn't walk into the store like this. Someone would notice. Someone would ask questions he couldn't answer. Daniel ducked into the small alcove beside the building's entrance, pressing his back against the cold marble wall. His hands shook as he tried to stuff the lace back into his shoe, but it was too long and kept sliding out. Tears of frustration burned his eyes. He'd walked too far to go back to the children's home, and Mrs. Patterson was counting on him to bring the milk for the younger kids' cereal. But he couldn't take another step with his secret exposed. Above him, 37 floors up, David Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, phone pressed to his ear as his assistant rattled off the morning schedule. His gaze wandered down to the street below, a habit he'd developed during stressful calls. The city looked like a perfectly organized machine from this height, tiny figures moving with purpose, along predetermined paths. It was orderly, predictable, unlike the chaos of human emotions that had cost him his family. "Sir, the board meeting has been moved to 10:30, his assistant, Jennifer, was saying. "And legal needs to review the Patterson Industries contract before you sign." "Fine," David replied absently, still watching the street. Something caught his attention. A small figure, huddled against the building's base, partially hidden in the shadows. A child. "Jennifer, I'll call you back." David ended the call and pressed closer to the window. The boy couldn't be more than 8 or 9, wearing clothes that looked several sizes too big. He appeared to be struggling with something, his small shoulders shaking. David's chest tightened unexpectedly. The child's posture reminded him of Michael during his first day of school, when he'd hidden behind Linda's legs because his shoelaces had come undone, and he was embarrassed. Without fully understanding why, David found himself walking toward the elevator. He told himself he was just going down to grab coffee from the lobby cafe, that his interest in the child was merely passing curiosity. But as the elevator descended, his reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man who looked more concerned than curious. The lobby of Chen Technologies was a monument to success. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and abstract sculptures worth more than most people's homes commanded attention in carefully lit alcoves. David nodded to the security guards as he pushed through the revolving door, stepping from climate-controlled luxury into the crisp autumn air. He found the boy exactly where he'd seen him from above, tucked into the small space beside the building's entrance. Up close, David could see the child's dilemma clearly. One shoelace had come completely undone and was trailing on the ground, while the boy frantically tried to hide it by pulling his jacket down over his feet. David paused, uncertain. In his world, problems were solved with phone calls and strategic decisions. This was different. This required something he'd forgotten how to do. Be human. "Excuse me," he said gently, crouching down to the boy's level. "Are you all right?" Daniel's head snapped up, his brown eyes wide with surprise and fear. He'd been so focused on his shoe that he hadn't noticed the tall man in the expensive suit approaching. Now this stranger was kneeling beside him, close enough that Daniel could smell cologne that probably cost more than everything in his bedroom at the children's home. "I'm fine, sir," Daniel whispered, trying to scoot further back against the wall. His grandmother had taught him to be polite to adults, especially adults who looked important. This man definitely looked important. His suit was perfectly pressed, his dark hair was styled just right, and when he smiled, his teeth were as white as the marble behind him. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some trouble," David said, gesturing toward Daniel's feet. "Is there something I can help you with?" Daniel felt his face burn with embarrassment. He'd been discovered. His carefully guarded secret was exposed to this sophisticated stranger who probably lived in a world where 8-year-olds didn't exist unless they were his own children. "It's nothing, sir. My shoe." David looked down and understood immediately. The untied lace told a story that made his chest ache. "I see. Would you like me to help you tie it?" The question hung in the air between them. Daniel stared at this man who looked like he belonged on the cover of business magazines, offering to kneel on a dirty sidewalk to help with something so basic, so elementary. "You would do that, sir?" "Of course," David said, settling more comfortably onto one knee. "What's your name?" "Daniel Martinez, sir." "Well, Daniel Martinez, I'm David, and I happen to be pretty good at tying shoes." David's voice carried a warmth that surprised him. When had he last spoken to a child without checking his phone or thinking about his next meeting? Daniel hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly extended his foot. David gently took the lace in his hands, noticing how worn the sneakers were, how they had been repaired multiple times with different types of tape and glue. These weren't shoes that had been outgrown and replaced. These were shoes that had been preserved out of necessity. "You know," David said as he began working with the lace, "I learned to tie my shoes when I was about your age. My father taught me in our garage one Saturday morning. I was so proud when I finally got it right that I untied and retied them about 50 times that day." Daniel watched in fascination as David's fingers moved with careful precision, creating loops and pulling the lace through in a pattern that looked almost like magic. 50 times? "At least," David chuckled. "My mother thought I'd lost my mind. She kept asking why I was taking my shoes off every 5 minutes. He finished the first shoe and moved to the second, which was also showing signs of loosening. "There we go. Good as new." But instead of standing up and walking away, David remained kneeling. Something in the boy's expression held him there. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know how to tie your shoes?" The question was asked so gently, without judgment or condescension, that Daniel felt safe enough to tell the truth. "No, sir. I never learned. My grandmother was going to teach me, but she got sick. And at the home where I live, everyone's always too busy." David felt something crack open inside his chest. "The home where you live?" "The Riverside Children's Home, sir. Mrs. Patterson takes care of us, but there are 23 kids and she can't do everything." The words hit David like a physical blow. This child was an orphan. Alone in the world, struggling with something as simple as shoe tying because there was no one to teach him. David thought of his own sons, 3,000 miles away, who had learned to tie their shoes years ago. He thought of all the small moments he'd missed, all the basic lessons he'd been too busy to provide. "Daniel," David said slowly, Would you like me to teach you? The boy's eyes widened. You mean, really teach me? So I can do it myself? Absolutely. Right here. Right now. David settled more comfortably on the sidewalk, completely oblivious to the stares from passers-by, who couldn't believe they were seeing the CEO of Chen Technologies giving a shoe-tying lesson on the street. First, we'll need to untie what I just did so you can learn from the beginning. For the next 20 minutes, David forgot about board meetings and quarterly reports. He forgot about the Patterson Industries contract waiting on his desk and the conference call with investors scheduled for 9 o'clock. His entire world narrowed down to this small boy with serious brown eyes who was determined to master this fundamental skill. Daniel proved to be a quick learner, his small fingers following David's patient instructions. Make the bunny ears, David explained, using the same method his father had taught him decades ago. Now the bunny goes around the tree and through the hole. Like this? Daniel asked, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Perfect. Now pull tight. Not too tight, just enough to hold. When Daniel successfully tied his shoe for the first time, his face lit up with such pure joy that David felt his throat constrict. When had he last felt that kind of simple happiness? When had accomplishment meant something more than stock prices and profit margins? I did it! Daniel exclaimed, then quickly lowered his voice, remembering where he was. I mean, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. You're very welcome, Daniel. And you can call me David. Daniel looked at him with wonder. Are you sure, sir? You look really important. David laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. Not too important to help a friend learn something new. We're friends? The word came out like a whisper, as if Daniel was afraid to hope for such a thing. I'd like to be, if that's okay with you. Daniel nodded eagerly, then seemed to remember something. His face fell slightly. I have to go get milk for Mrs. Patterson. The little kids need it for breakfast. Where are you going? Just to the corner store, but I have to hurry back. David looked at his watch, then at this child who had somehow managed to rearrange his entire morning without even trying. Daniel, would you mind if I walked with you? I was just about to get some coffee anyway. The lie came easily, but it felt like the most honest thing David had said in months. Daniel's face brightened again. You really want to walk with me? I really do. As they walked toward the corner store, Daniel chattered about the children's home, about Mrs. Patterson's kindness despite being overwhelmed, about his friend Miguel who was good at basketball, and about the way the morning light looked different when you watched it from the roof where he sometimes went to think. David found himself genuinely listening, asking questions, caring about the answers. At the store, David watched Daniel carefully count out his crumpled bills to pay for the milk, counting twice to make sure he had enough. The boy's pride was evident in the way he handled the transaction himself, politely thanking the cashier and carefully carrying the milk jug with both hands. Daniel, David said as they walked back toward the children's home, would it be all right if I visited you sometime? Maybe we could practice tying shoes again. Make sure you've really got it down. Daniel stopped walking and stared up at him. You want to visit me? At the home? If Mrs. Patterson says it's okay, yes. But why? I mean, you're... Daniel gestured at David's suit, his polished shoes, the confidence he carried like an expensive accessory. Because everyone deserves to have someone who cares about whether they can tie their shoes, David said simply. And because I think you and I could be good friends. As they reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Daniel turned to face David fully. Mr. David, can I ask you something? Of course. Why were you so nice to me? Most people don't even see me. The question pierced through David's carefully constructed defenses. He knelt down again, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. Because you reminded me of something important that I forgot. Sometimes the most important things in life are also the simplest ones. Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to light up the gray morning. I'll practice every day until you come back. I'll be back soon, I promise. As David watched Daniel disappear around the corner, milk jug clutched carefully in his small hands, he realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he had made a promise that had nothing to do with profit margins or business deals. He had made a promise to a child who had asked for nothing more than help tying his shoes. David pulled out his phone to call Jennifer and reschedule his morning meetings. He had some research to do about children's homes and a small boy who had somehow managed to crack open a heart he thought had turned to stone. 3 days later, David found himself standing in front of a weathered Victorian house that looked like it had been painted yellow sometime in the previous decade. The Riverside Children's Home bore little resemblance to the sterile efficiency of his corporate world. The front porch sagged slightly on one side. Children's bicycles in various states of repair lined the walkway, and the sound of laughter and occasional shouting drifted through the open windows. David had spent those 3 days thinking about Daniel more than he cared to admit. During board meetings, he'd find his mind wandering to the boy's careful way of counting his money at the store. While reviewing quarterly projections, he'd remember the pure joy on Daniel's face when he'd successfully tied his shoe for the first time. The image had haunted him in a way that profit margins and market analyses never could. Mrs. Patricia Patterson answered the door herself, wiping flour-covered hands on a well-worn apron. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen enough to be cautious but not enough to be cynical. Her gaze took in David's expensive suit and perfectly polished shoes with the wariness of someone who had dealt with too many well-dressed people making promises they didn't keep. "You must be Mr. Chen," she said, extending a hand that was surprisingly firm. "Daniel hasn't stopped talking about you since Tuesday. I have to admit I wasn't sure you'd actually show up." "I always keep my promises to children, Mrs. Patterson," David replied, and realized as he said it that he wanted it to be true, even if it hadn't always been in the past. "Please, call me Pat. And I hope you mean that, because Daniel has been practicing tying his shoes obsessively. He's worn out 3 pairs of laces this week." Her stern expression softened slightly. "He's a good boy, Mr. Chen. He's been through more than any child should have to endure." She led him through a house that buzzed with controlled chaos. Children of various ages moved through the hallways, some doing homework at a large dining room table, others playing quietly in corners with toys that had clearly been loved by many previous owners. The walls were covered with children's artwork, school certificates, and photographs of smiling faces. It was nothing like David's sterile penthouse, but it felt more like a home than anywhere he'd lived in years. Daniel appeared at the top of the staircase, his face breaking into a grin that made David's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The boy practically flew down the stairs, then stopped abruptly at the bottom, suddenly shy. "Hi, Mr. David," he said softly. "You really came back." "I told you I would," David replied, kneeling down to Daniel's level. "How's the shoe tying practice going?" "Watch this." Daniel sat on the bottom step and began unlacing his right shoe with exaggerated concentration. David noticed that these weren't the same worn sneakers from their first meeting. These looked newer, though still clearly second-hand. "Mrs. Pat got me different shoes from the donation box," Daniel explained, following David's gaze. "She said if I was going to practice so much, I needed laces that wouldn't break." He began the tying process, his small fingers moving with careful precision. Bunny ears, around the tree, through the hole, and pulled tight. The lace held perfectly. Daniel looked up at David with such pride that David felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "That's excellent, Daniel. You've been practicing hard. Every day, just like I promised." Daniel stood up and looked at David expectantly. "What should we do now?" The question caught David off guard. In his world, meetings had agendas, interactions had purposes, and time was measured in billable hours. But looking down at this boy who was waiting for nothing more than his attention, David realized he had no plan beyond showing up. "What would you like to do?" he asked. Daniel's eyes widened as if no adult had ever asked his opinion before. "Well, I could show you my room. Or we could sit on the porch and talk. Or—" He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "There's this puzzle in the common room that no one can figure out. It's got 1,000 pieces, and it's a picture of the ocean. I've been working on it for 2 months, but I can only find time to do a few pieces at a time because the older kids need the table for homework. I'd love to see this puzzle. David said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. The common room was a large space that served multiple purposes. One corner had a small television surrounded by mismatched chairs. Another had the dining table Daniel had mentioned, and a third contained several beanbags and a bookshelf with well-worn paperbacks. The puzzle was spread across a card table near the window, about half completed. David could see why it was challenging. The image was almost entirely blue water, with subtle variations in shade and texture. I started with the edges, like the box says to do, Daniel explained, settling into a chair that was too big for him. But then I got stuck, because all the middle pieces looked the same. David pulled up another chair, studying the scattered pieces. You know, I used to do puzzles with my sons when they were younger. The trick with puzzles like this is to look for patterns you can't see at first glance. You have sons? Daniel asked, his voice filled with curiosity rather than jealousy. I do, Michael and Stephen. They're 11 now, living with their mother in Seattle. The words came easier than David expected. Usually, mentioning his sons brought a sharp stab of guilt and regret. That's far away, Daniel said simply. Do you miss them? The directness of the question, asked without judgment or agenda, cut straight to David's heart. Every day. Why don't you visit them? It's complicated. David started, then stopped. He was talking to an 8-year-old who had lost everyone and had no one to visit. His excuses about busy schedules and difficult relationships suddenly seemed pathetic. Actually, it's not complicated at all. I've been afraid they wouldn't want to see me. Daniel considered this seriously. Maybe they're afraid you don't want to see them. The simple wisdom hit David like a physical blow. From the mouths of babes, he thought, remembering something his own father used to say. You might be right about that, Daniel. They worked on the puzzle in comfortable silence for a while, occasionally talking about the children's home, Daniel's school, or David's memories of doing puzzles with his sons. David found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. The time Michael had swallowed a puzzle piece, and they'd spent 4 hours in the emergency room, the elaborate fort Stephen had built out of puzzle boxes. The way both boys used to argue over who got to place the final piece. They sound nice, Daniel said, carefully fitting together 2 pieces that formed part of a wave. I bet they miss doing puzzles with you. Other children drifted in and out of the common room, some stopping to add a piece or two to the puzzle, others just curious about the well-dressed man who was sitting with Daniel. David noticed how the older children looked out for the younger ones, how they shared snacks and helped with homework without being asked. There was a sense of family here, born of necessity, but no less real for it. A girl of about 10, with bright red hair and freckles, approached the table. Daniel, who's your friend? This is Mr. David, Daniel said proudly. He taught me how to tie my shoes. I'm Sarah, the girl said, extending her hand to David with formality that seemed learned rather than natural. Are you here about adoption? The question hung in the air awkwardly. David realized that for these children, any adult visitor represented potential hope. No, Sarah. I'm just here to visit Daniel. Oh. Sarah's face fell slightly, then brightened again. That's nice, though. Daniel doesn't get many visitors. After Sarah left, Daniel was quiet for several minutes, focusing intently on the puzzle. Finally, he looked up at David. I used to think about being adopted a lot, but I stopped. Why? Because wanting something too much makes it hurt more when it doesn't happen. Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather rather than the deepest longing of his heart. It's better to just be happy with what you have. David felt something break inside his chest. This child, who had every reason to be bitter about the unfairness of life, had instead learned to find contentment in small moments. How had David, with all his advantages and opportunities, managed to lose that ability? Daniel, he said carefully, what if someone wanted to spend time with you not because they wanted to adopt you, but just because they enjoyed your company? Would that be okay? Daniel looked at him with those serious brown eyes. You mean like a friend? Exactly like a friend. I'd like that, Daniel said softly. I'd like that a lot. They were interrupted by Mrs. Patterson calling for dinner. David was surprised to realize they'd been working on the puzzle for nearly 3 hours. The afternoon had disappeared without him once checking his phone or thinking about work. "Would you like to stay for dinner, Mr. Chen?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "It's just spaghetti and garlic bread, nothing fancy." David's first instinct was to decline. He had dinner reservations at an exclusive restaurant with potential investors. But, looking at Daniel's hopeful expression, he found himself nodding. "I'd be honored." Dinner at the children's home was unlike anything David had experienced. 24 people crowded around a table meant for 12, with the older children helping serve the younger ones. Conversations overlapped, stories were interrupted, and laughter punctuated every few minutes. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely wonderful. David found himself seated between Daniel and a 5-year-old named Marcus, who insisted on explaining the plot of his favorite cartoon in excruciating detail. Across from him, a teenage girl named Jessica talked about her plans to study nursing after she aged out of the system. The teenagers, David realized, weren't just residents here. They were big brothers and sisters to the younger children, providing the stability and continuity that the constant turnover of staff couldn't offer. "Mr. David?" Daniel said during a brief lull in conversation. "Would you like to see my room after dinner?" "I'd love to." Daniel's room was on the 3rd floor, a small space he shared with 2 other boys. The beds were neatly made, and personal belongings were stored in small boxes under each bed. Daniel's corner contained a few books, some drawings, and the photograph of his grandmother that David had heard about from Mrs. Patterson. "She taught me to read," Daniel said, picking up the photograph. "She said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you." David studied the faded image of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "She looks like she was very wise." She was. She used to say that God puts people in our lives exactly when we need them. Daniel looked up at David. "Maybe that's why you came to help me with my shoes." The simple faith in the statement made David's throat tight. "Maybe it is." As the evening wound down, David realized he had missed his dinner with the investors entirely. His phone had buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from Jennifer, but, for the first time in years, business had taken a back seat to something more important. "Mr. David," Daniel said as they stood at the front door, "will you come back again?" "Would you like me to?" "More than anything." David knelt down and looked into those trusting brown eyes. "Then I'll be back. Maybe we can finish that puzzle." "Really?" "Really. And Daniel?" "Next time, maybe you can teach me something." "Like what?" David thought about the lessons he'd learned that day, about finding joy in simple moments, about the value of chosen family, about the courage it took to hope when hope had been disappointed before. "I'm sure you'll think of something." As David drove back to his empty penthouse, he found himself thinking not about the deal he'd missed or the investors he'd stood up, but about a little boy who had learned to tie his shoes through sheer determination and was now teaching a successful CEO what really mattered in life. For the first time in years, David went to sleep that night thinking about tomorrow, not because of what he had to accomplish, but because of who he got to see. The boardroom at Chen Technologies had never felt more hostile. David sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, facing 12 of the most powerful people in the city's business community. Their expressions ranged from concerned to openly disapproving, as board chairman Robert Harrison shuffled through a stack of photographs like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "These were taken over the past 2 weeks," Harrison announced, sliding the images across the table toward David. "Our CEO, photographed entering a children's home multiple times, playing with orphans. Missing critical investor meetings." David looked at the photos with a mixture of anger and sadness. Someone had been following him, documenting his visits to see Daniel. The images showed him kneeling on the sidewalk, teaching Daniel to tie his shoes, sitting at the dinner table surrounded by children, working on the ocean puzzle, with Daniel's small hand guiding his fingers to the right piece. "I fail to see how my personal charitable activities concern this board," David said evenly, though his jaw was tight with barely controlled fury. "Charitable activities?" Harrison's laugh was cold. "David, you've canceled 6 major meetings in 2 weeks. The Morrison deal fell through because you weren't there to close it." Our stock price has dropped 4 points. Board member Patricia Wells leaned forward, her voice carrying false sympathy. David, we're worried about you. This behavior is erratic. Spending time at an orphanage, befriending random children. It's not professional. Random children? David's voice dropped dangerously low. You're talking about kids who have lost everything, who are just trying to survive. And that's admirable, truly. Harrison interjected smoothly. But it's not your job. Your job is to this company, to our shareholders, to the bottom line. These emotional entanglements are affecting your judgment. David thought about Daniel's face when he'd successfully completed the ocean puzzle the week before. The boy had insisted David place the final piece, saying it was a team effort. The memory of that pure joy seemed to belong to a different universe than this cold boardroom. Furthermore, Harrison continued, producing another document, our legal team has concerns about liability. What if something happens to you while you're at this facility? What if one of these children gets hurt while in your presence? The company could face lawsuits. You want me to stop visiting the children's home, David said. It wasn't a question. We want you to remember who you are, Patricia replied. You're the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. Your time is worth thousands of dollars per hour. Spending it playing games with orphans is not just inefficient, it's irresponsible to everyone who depends on this company for their livelihood. Harrison leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd made his point. David, you built this company by being ruthless when necessary, by making hard choices. Don't let sentimentality destroy what you've worked so hard to create. David stared at the photographs scattered across the table. In one, Daniel was showing him a drawing of the two of them working on the puzzle together. In another, he was surrounded by children at dinner, laughing at something Marcus had said. He looked happier in these pictures than he had in any professional headshot or magazine cover. The board has discussed this at length, Harrison continued. We're prepared to offer a compromise. End your involvement with this orphanage, and we'll make a substantial corporate donation, say $50,000. That's more good than you could ever do personally. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. David knew his board well enough to understand this wasn't really a compromise. It was an ultimatum disguised as generosity. And if I refuse? Then we'll have to seriously consider whether you're still the right person to lead this company, Patricia said quietly. The board has the authority to call for a vote of no confidence. David felt the walls closing in around him. He'd spent 15 years building Chen Technologies from a small startup into an industry giant. Every decision, every sacrifice, every missed moment with his own children had been in service of this company. And now they were asking him to sacrifice Daniel too. That evening, David sat in his car outside the Riverside Children's Home for nearly an hour before finally going inside. Daniel was waiting for him in the common room, a new puzzle spread across the card table. This one was a picture of a city skyline at night, all twinkling lights and soaring buildings. I thought we could do this one next, Daniel said excitedly. Mrs. Pat said it reminded her of where you work. David's throat felt thick as he sat down beside the boy. Daniel, we need to talk. Something in his tone made Daniel's smile fade. Did I do something wrong? No, buddy. You didn't do anything wrong. David struggled to find words that would make sense to an 8-year-old. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices about how they spend their time. Daniel's face went very still. David recognized the expression. It was the same careful blankness he'd seen when other visitors had come to the home and left without choosing anyone. You can't come anymore, Daniel said quietly. It wasn't a question. My work is very demanding, and there are people who think I should focus more on that. Because I'm not important enough. The words hit David like a physical blow. Daniel, that's not true. You are incredibly important, but not as important as your work. Daniel's voice was steady, but David could see the tears gathering in his eyes. It's okay, Mr. David. I understand. The boy's acceptance was somehow worse than anger would have been. David wanted to tell him about the board meeting, about the ultimatum, about how none of this was his choice. But how could he explain corporate politics to a child who had already learned too many harsh lessons about adult priorities? I want you to know, David said carefully, that the time we've spent together has meant more to me than any business deal I've ever made. Daniel nodded, but David could see him withdrawing, pulling back into the protective shell that had kept him safe through 4 years in the system. Thank you for teaching me to tie my shoes, Mr. David. I practice every day. Daniel. I should probably help Mrs. Pat with the little kids now, Daniel said, standing up from the table. They need their baths before bedtime. David watched the boy walk away, his small shoulders straight with forced dignity. At the doorway, Daniel paused and looked back. Mr. David, I hope your work makes you happy. Then he was gone, leaving David alone with a half-finished puzzle of a city that suddenly looked cold and empty despite all its lights. David drove home in a fog of guilt and anger. His penthouse had never felt more like a prison. He stood at the window looking down at the city below, thinking about a small boy who was probably lying in bed trying not to cry, and a board of directors who thought they'd solved a problem by removing what they saw as a distraction. His phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. Smart choice, David. The Morrison deal is back on the table. Meeting tomorrow at 9. David stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. He'd made his choice, and everyone seemed satisfied except the only person whose opinion truly mattered to him. Down at the children's home, Daniel lay awake listening to his roommates breathe in the darkness. He'd known this day would come. Adults always left eventually. He'd been foolish to think Mr. David would be different just because he'd been kind. Kindness, Daniel had learned, was often temporary, but the hurt that came after lasted much longer. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the photograph of his grandmother. I tried to remember what you said about people coming into our lives when we need them, he whispered. But maybe I was wrong about what I needed. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, unaware that somewhere in its heart, two people who had found something precious in each other were now facing the darkness alone. The call came at 2 in the morning. David jerked awake to his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Mrs. Patterson's voice was strained with worry. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been an accident. Daniel was hit by a car while running an errand. He's at Mercy General Hospital. David was dressed and in his car within minutes, his heart pounding as he raced through empty streets. The hospital corridors were too bright, too sterile, reminding him of another night, years ago when he'd gotten a similar call about his own father. He found Mrs. Patterson in the waiting room, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. How is he? Broken leg, some bruises. He'll be fine physically. She looked at David with eyes that held both gratitude and accusation. He was crossing the street to get medicine for one of the younger children who had a fever. The driver said Daniel seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. David's chest tightened with guilt. Had his abandonment caused this? Had Daniel been so upset that he'd stopped paying attention to traffic? Can I see him? Mrs. Patterson studied his face for a long moment. He's been asking for you, even though you broke his heart. The words stung because they were true. David followed her down the hallway to a small room where Daniel lay propped up in bed, his leg in a cast, looking smaller than ever against the white hospital sheets. Mr. David? Daniel's voice was weak, but his eyes lit up with genuine joy. You came. Of course I came. David moved to the bedside, overwhelmed by relief and remorse. How are you feeling, buddy? Better now that you're here. I was scared you wouldn't want to see me anymore. The innocent statement broke something in David's heart. This child, lying injured in a hospital bed, was worried about whether David wanted to see him. Daniel, there is nowhere else I would rather be right now. But your work, my work will wait. David sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle Daniel's injured leg. I've been thinking a lot since I saw you last, about what really matters, about the kind of person I want to be. Daniel's eyes were fixed on his face with the intensity of someone much older. What did you decide? I decided that any job that asks me to choose between success and caring about people I love isn't worth having. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I brought you something. Daniel took the paper with shaking hands and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter of resignation addressed to the Chen Technologies Board of Directors. You quit your job? For me? I quit my job for me, David said gently. You helped me remember who I used to be before I got lost in boardrooms and profit margins. You reminded me that the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars. But what will you do now? David smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. Well, I was thinking about starting a foundation. Maybe something that helps children's homes get better funding, better resources. I might need a consultant, though. Someone who really understands what kids need. Daniel's face broke into the brightest smile David had ever seen. I know just the person. 6 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Chen Children's Foundation was held in the newly renovated common room of the Riverside Children's Home. The space was transformed with new furniture, updated computers, and a library that Daniel had helped design. But the most important change wasn't visible in the renovations. David stood at the front of the room, no longer wearing expensive suits but dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. Beside him, Daniel balanced on crutches, his cast finally removed but still healing. Mrs. Patterson beamed from the audience, surrounded by children whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. When I first met Daniel, David told the gathered crowd, he asked me a simple question: "Can you teach me to tie my shoes?" What I didn't realize was that in teaching him that small skill, he would teach me something infinitely more valuable. He taught me that success isn't about what you accumulate, it's about who you help along the way. The foundation had already helped 3 other children's homes in the city, providing funding for education programs, medical care, and recreational activities. But more than that, it had given David a purpose that filled the emptiness that corporate success never could. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the children returned to their evening routines, David and Daniel sat together on the front porch swing that had been installed as part of the renovations. "Mr. David, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever miss your old job? The money and the big office?" David considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the excitement of closing a big deal, but I've never once missed the feeling of going to bed wondering if anything I did that day actually mattered." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad you chose me." "I'm glad you chose me too, buddy." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, David thought about the journey that had brought him here. A chance encounter on a busy sidewalk had changed everything. A simple request for help had transformed 2 lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. "Hey, Daniel." "Yeah?" "Thank you for asking me to teach you to tie your shoes." Daniel grinned and leaned against David's shoulder. "Thank you for saying yes." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.